gamers, Power Word Heal here, and today we're going to be talking about GDKP once more. Again, I know, but this topic is really heated up because of all the talk around Burning Crusade, and people are freaking out because it's probably not going to have GDKP, it seems like, at this point. And we've had some of this conversation before, but I kind of want to approach it from a different angle. And this is going to be more off the cuff, but it's kind of just, I want to ask people who really love GDKP some questions about the game and kind of like what they enjoy and what they want out of the game. So if you happen to be a GDKP enjoyer, feel free to let me know what you think in the comments. And, I watch other creators, and somebody was making a video about the Burning Crusade, probably not having GDKP. And there's a comment that kind of came up that I think really just fully encapsulates what I perceive that people think about GDKP, because there's kind of two camps, right? There's like the first camp that really likes GDKP because they can whale and buy all the good items for their character. And I've kind of always been of the opinion that this is sort of like the minority of players, right? Most players are not whaling now. There's still quite a few whales out there, but still, when you compare it to the population at large, the whaling isn't so much the problem. But the argument that you always hear, and it seems to be the argument that people are much more willing to accept and think is more reasonable, that the reason why they like GDKP is because it essentially pays for all the consumes and allows them to raid on as many characters as they want. And this is seen as like a more kosher type of argument, right? Like everybody, or most normal players, have a disdain for the player that kind of goes on G2G, swipes their credit card, gets 250k gold, or like gold cap essentially, and then goes and tries to buy Gressel in the next GDKP, right? Like there's a lot of kind of loathing for that type of player amidst the community. Now, ironically, that player is subsidizing all the other players that are participating in the GDKP system, but still, you can at least understand in theory why people would kind of like dislike this approach. But the other approach is, it's seen as a lot more benign, a lot more reasonable, and it could be, depending on how you view things, and that's kind of the point of this video, I guess. So I'm going to read the comment that I was talking about that kind of encapsulates everything, and then we'll kind of like ask a couple more questions. So I got it right here. Let me just pull it up. I didn't even start my thing yet. The end of SOD was the way. Cheap raiding mats and world buffs. My guild donated mats for world buffs each week. Not farming mats allowed us to play the game and do world PvP and other events. We played the game and didn't log in to farm just so we could raid. So I actually like this comment too because it touches on world buffs, which I'll also touch upon in this video, because I think it's actually, they're very similar things when you're talking about using GDKP to kind of fund your character, and I'll explain why in a moment. But let's kind of just go into the statement, and like the first thing, well, not the first thing, but kind of like the third sentence here I found actually really funny. Not farming mats allowed us to play the game and do PvP and other events. So it's interesting. So this person doesn't consider farming to be a part of the game. Like he's viewing he farms to play the game, essentially. And that really strikes me, because I guess the first question I would want to ask is, would you think the game, if you do GDKP, and this is your reason for doing GDKP, that you want to fund your characters, essentially, do you think that we should be able to just have a character at level 60, so you wouldn't have to, therefore, get gold to boost a character? And also, would you rather just not have any consumables in the game whatsoever, right? So things like mongoose, things like flasks, and even world buffs. Like, what if we just removed world buffs? And like, just across the board, you don't have rend, you don't have songflower, none of these things do anything, can't be brought into raid. Would that be preferable to you guys? And that's an honest question. Like, it's not like a troll question or anything like that. But I know I've asked this to other people, and I feel like you get some people in this crowd that likes GDKP and just wants their character funded that say yes, but then when you ask the kind of like the start questions like this, like why not just remove all of this, right? If all of this is like an obstacle, you get a little bit of pushback, and people are like, well, no, not really. I mean, those are all core parts of the game, like I wouldn't want to see them removed or anything like that. And it's like, well, why not though? Because clearly you don't want to interact with them, right? And to me, it comes down to this like weird cognitive dissonance where it's like they want to have these advantages, and they want them, I feel like, over other players specifically, right? Because if you didn't have them at all, then there would be no way to use a potion to get an advantage or use a world buff or anything like that. So they want all the advantages, but only if the way that they want to acquire them is fun for them, okay? So for them, they just want to be able to essentially buy them from the auction house, and the way that is fun for getting them is doing raids to get gold, and then they just use that gold to buy the stuff from the AH, right? So that's fun because they get to have a competitive advantage over others doing the thing that they want to do. And to me, it seems like a little bit self-serving, right? And it's a bit ironic because the thing that they're doing to get the funds to buy these things is ironically more profitable than the people that are actually churning out the consumables for the system that they're participating in to begin with, right? So in other words, like you being the alchemist, as we all know in Classic WoW, if you've ever done like alchemy as a profession, there's not really much of a margin on, the stuff that you kind of make. And kind of like the same with like herbalism to a degree. You're not making massive profits from, there's not margins really in the case of herbalism because you're farming raw mats, but you get the point of what I'm saying. You're not making massive profits from herbalism, and you're not scoring crazy insane margins from having alchemy as another profession. And also in Classic WoW, engineering is sort of like a combat profession, so you're giving up engineering to essentially, get these gold-making professions, but they're not really gold-making professions when something like GDKP is in the game, because they just pale in comparison to something like GDKP. So we want to have the items to kind of bump ourselves up from other players, but we don't want the systems that create the items to be essentially more rewarding than GDKP, because the thing is, it's not really a case where like they could be, right? So it's not a case of like, oh well, it just happens to be that you get more gold from GDKP, and like, yeah man, I just wish we could find a way where all the people who farm the alchemy mats would be would be super rich too, right? And what people will say is they'll be like, well, if you just banned all the bots in the game, man, then somebody would have to go out there and farm all the herbs manually, and that would mean the price would go up on a lot of these things, and that would mean that when people are doing these GDKPs, the money that you get from the cut, a lot more of it is going to have to be spent on buying the actual materials, which is, in turn is going to make the profitability, like kind of ratio of GDKP to farming the mats a lot closer. And, there is truth to that, but the problem is you're never probably banning enough of the bots for it to really make the type of impact that you're talking about here, right? So the problem is, as long as GDKP is in the game, it's always going to be the predominant system essentially for making gold. Not only that, obviously there's things like boosting. People always get on me when I talk about GDKP. I don't mention boosting, so I'll mention it here. I'm not mentioning or not mentioning boosting for any particular reason or anything of that nature. They're both the same to me. I think they're both incredibly harmful for the game. To me, they both essentially count as player services, right? And like one, you're essentially just selling a carry, and in the other, you are selling a different type of carry. You're selling a carry for gear in one case and selling a carry for levels in the other case. So they're very similar, and I think that they are both bad and harmful, in part because They are both kind of like two things that you can do that will make you the most amount of gold. They don't encourage you to participate in any of the game systems at all. But yeah, it's just confusing to me how these people, they'll use all the consumables that other people make, but then they don't want to have to actually farm for them in any meaningful way themselves, or do anything of equivalent value even that would allow them to obtain the consumables that's essentially not just like sitting at a raid and soaking gold from players who whaled. And that's one aspect of it. And the other aspect really is just, I don't, like, what about scarcity? Like, to me, so we've established that you guys kind of mostly want these consumables and buffs in the game, right? It's not that you want to get rid of them. So if you want them in the game, the only way it really makes sense for me to have them in the game is that they should be scarce in some way, right? Because if they're not scarce, then it sort of is pointless to have them to begin with. Like, if it's plentiful, like this guy is saying with sod, where everything is cheap and anybody can go out and buy everything, then what's the point of even having them at all? You might as well not even have them. And that's my whole thing, is like, with the classic community, the full rack of buffs, the full rack of potions has become so baseline that it's completely defeated the purpose of these kind of professions to begin with. Like, alchemy as an intrinsic profession would be worth quite a bit if it was really hard to actually make the potions, right? Because now you're probably going to have a disproportionate access to more potions than somebody who doesn't have alchemy, okay? Because if they have engineering, so they can do more maybe combat damage in the raid through like raw items, right? Things like bombs and things of that nature. They're not going to be able to make as much money likely with that profession and to be able to afford every alchemy potion that they want. They might be able to get some, right? But the alchemist is going to be able to make the gold to get the potions they want, but they're not going to have the benefit of engineering. They don't have engineering leveled, right? So therefore, they aren't getting all of the combat benefits. And there's a bit of a trade-off in that scenario, right? If there's some scarcity involved in creating some of these items. But when everybody just has access to every potion under the sun, now the alchemist is just, there's no reason to be an alchemist, right? You're taking one for the team to be an alchemist, because why would you do that when you could just have the combat profession of engineering? And like I said, it all goes back to scarcity. This problem could be fixed, but we're choosing to not fix it. And the worst thing is that the devs seem to be immediately acquiescing to the players on this issue, right? Like, whenever there's a problem, whenever people can't get the consumables that they want, the resources that they want, people complain on the subreddit, they complain on the forums, and Blizzard's like, oh, we got to put in a change to make it so that people can get these items. Now, there's been some cases of this, like the Flask situation in Anniversary, and I understand that when you have an item like Black Lotus, that, the spawn situation is kind of creates a unique problem, especially with the bots in this particular version of the game. So I understand that change that they made, and I don't think that was a negative change in particular, right? But the problem is it didn't really stop there. There was people complaining throughout the rest of Annie as well, right? That, like, we needed more. They wanted even less scarcity is the idea. They wanted consumes to be dirt cheap, like in SOD, so they could equip their 8 characters out with fresh potion racks every week, fresh buff racks every week. And in my opinion, it's just like, if there's no effort in put forth to try and get the stuff, then you might as well just bake it all into the character and not have it to begin with. It doesn't make any sense to me. It's the same with the world buffs. Like, I understand the concept of the boon. I really do. But the whole problem with the boon is that at base, you're not really supposed to have these buffs going into raid, period. And if you're not supposed to have them, then it should take effort to go out and get them, and it should be hard to kind of get them into the raid. And it really just needs to be a cultural shift, in my opinion, from people in the community, where we really need to break away from this idea that we need every last buff and every last consumable to go into a raid and perform. And, obviously you're going to perform worse if you don't have all these things, but that's okay, right? And this obsession with always needing every possible buff, it's creating a system where we can't really have these kind of fun, unique professions, and we can't have scarcity, because anytime we start to encroach towards scarcity, there's a riot. And people will blame the bots, right? They'll be like, oh, well, it's the fault of the bots, man. Like, I can't go out there and farm, because the bots are beating me to all the resources and things of that nature. But it's just not reality. For a while now in Anniversary, there's things you could do, fishing in particular. It's been pretty profitable, and just nobody wants to touch it. Nobody wants to go out into the world and get any resource, because the thing about a lot of the fishing resources is that they're not as highly contested as some of the other botted things like Mountain Silver Sage and Plague Bloom and things of that nature, right? So you see that this area that in the background footage here that I'm kind of going over, not a lot of people here now. There hasn't been a lot of people here throughout the course of Anniversary. I've been here various times, doing some farming here and there, and you could kind of always come out here and farm some of these things uncontested. And even the herbs and things of that nature, like Mountain Silver Sage, they were contested by the bots and things of that nature, but not to the degree that people were talking about. You could still get some gold by going out and farming, getting arcane crystals, getting herbs from places like Ungaro and things of that nature. But really, people just didn't want to do it, and I'm not confident that if you banned all the bots in the game, that people would ultimately be fine going out into the wilderness and gathering resources, unless it was so trivially easy that they could go out for like 30 minutes and be set for their entire week of raids. Which I think ultimately is just unreasonable, because again, if that's possible, then why do we even have the consumables to begin with? The whole point is scarcity. When you pop that potion, you are trading your gold for temporary power, and that should be how it's viewed. It shouldn't be the baseline. It should be an actual calculation that you want to perform. Do I want to use a flask this week? Do we need to use a flask this week? Is this a waste of gold? Is it not? Right? And yeah, so I guess I just don't understand this mentality of wanting everything cheap and easy, because it just takes away from having any of these things in the game to begin with. And this is one of the reasons why I loathe GDKP so much, because it just becomes the only reasonable method to obtain gold by, because it's by far the most efficient. And, even if you cut down on the amount of botting and the amount of gold brought in, raw gold, you're still never going to cut it down to the point where GDKP isn't going to be the best use of your time ever, right? And if it is, then what is the point of doing anything else? And if you're always going to have full racks of consumes, full racks of buffs, what is the point of even having them? Those are the questions I want to ask you guys if you're just super in love with GDKP. Reply down below in the comments. If you like this, like, comment, subscribe, and I will talk to you guys next time. See ya.